Thank you, Dr. Stenberg, and thank you to all of you for being here. A special thanks to the organizing committee for the opportunity to show some of the work that we have been doing at SDSU in collaboration with Pipestone and K-State. So just a brief agenda of what we'll be talking about. Initially, I'm going to present some data on some mitigation strategies or mitigants that we are testing against some of these viruses. Including SVA, which we are using as a surrogate for FMD, PED, PERS, and BHV1, which is our surrogate for PRV. And then Scott will discuss this data and some next steps on all of this. All the work that I'll present today is actually based on the study that we published on the survival of some viruses in these feed ingredients. Based on the results of that initial work, the first question is showing that viruses actually can actually survive in feed. The question was, can we actually add something to feed that will mitigate the risk of transmission? That's how we got into this project, or reduce the risk of transmission. So one of the first steps, and this is what I'm gonna talk today, was to evaluate the effectiveness of mitigants or feed additives in activating or reducing viral load throughout this transboundary model, the same model, shipping model that we used in our survival study. And then the next step, which is a project that is currently ongoing, would be to assess the efficacy of these mitigants following a natural consumption of contaminated and mitigated feed by swine. This is step number 2, is something that is ongoing. We don't have any data on that yet. So as I mentioned, the base for this work is presented here on this table, where we see all the red rectangles here representing viruses that survive in different feed ingredients that are imported in the US. And from this list, we selected 5 viruses to assess mitigants on these 5 viruses. I'm going to be presenting data on SVA, which is our surrogate for FMD, PEDV, BHV1, and PERS, and Dr. Megan Niederwarder is actually working with African swine fever at KSU. So how do we go about selecting mitigants or products that could be used here? So we selected, based on discussions that Dr. D had with several feed additive companies, 10 potential mitigants were selected for this trial. And the chemistries of these mitigants, including formaldehyde-based products, medium-chain fatty acid, organic acids, inorganic acids, essential oils, iodine-based products, or antioxidants. Some of these products are available on the market. They are sold as feed additives with other purposes. Others are just prototype products that are not yet on the market. For full disclosure, all the companies that had their products on their trial actually contributed to the product with partial funding. Each company provided an equal amount of funding for every product that was tested, but there was no input from any of the companies on the design or testing of these mitigants. The majority of the funding for this study was provided by SCHIC, and a minor part of it by the funding provided by the companies. So a quick overview of the experimental design. As I mentioned, we tested SVA, surrogate for FMD, PEDV, PERS, BHV1, our surrogate for PRV. We tested those 4 viruses against 4 or 2 feed ingredients, depending on their ability to survive on those. And all 10 mitigants were tested against these 4 viruses. So we tested 2 different scenarios of mitigation. The first one was addition of the mitigant at the country of origin of the ingredient. So we added the mitigant first. 2 weeks later, the feed ingredient was contaminated with each of the viruses. Then we incubated the feed, treated and untreated feed and contaminated feed in our environmental chamber to mimic the transportation conditions from the country of origin into the US. The second strategy that we used was addition of the mitigant in the US once the product was actually here. So what we did with that set of samples is we contaminated first with the virus, we incubated for 33 days, and 33 days, we chose 33 days because that's usually the time where the product will arrive at the meal in US after being transported from the country of origin, and it gets at the meal on day 33. We put those ingredients back in the environmental chamber for an additional 4 days, and on day 37 every sample was processed and then tested by PCR, virus isolation, titrations, and swine bioassay. So here's a table summarizing the results of Seneca virus. And this is just a plus and minus table showing results that we obtained in all four ingredients. As you can see, most of the ingredients were still positive. So this is infectious virus. This is based on virus isolation or swine bioassay. The rectangles highlighted in orange are samples that were negative on virus isolation in cell culture and then were tested by swine bioassay. And that's the result that we obtained on the swine bioassay. What this indicates is that even with the mitigation, we still had infectious virus in this product after the 37-day incubation. But it also tells us that those orange boxes where we need to choose the bioassay, it suggested to us that perhaps we do have a reduction in viral load in those ingredients. So what we did next was to determine the titers. So how much virus can we actually recover from those mitigated ingredients? And if we look at our positive control, the bars on the left of this slide, those are positive control, untreated or non-mitigated feed that were incubated for 37 days on the environmental chamber. So baseline titers on those samples were about 4.05 logs, and we initially spiked those ingredients with 5 logs of virus. So there is quite a significant amount of virus that is left viable there after the 37-day incubation. When we compare that baseline with the results that we obtained with some of these mitigants, we can clearly see that there were some of these products that actually led to reduction in viral load. And the titers that we recover from those 4 ingredients that are highlighted here with the red arrows were 1.1 to 1.6 logs at the end of the 37-day. Then we had a second group of mitigants in which that also reduced viral loads, but we observed some variability between the 2 conditions that we used, addition of the mitigant at the country of origin or addition of the mitigant in the US. And this could be likely explained by perhaps lower stability of these mitigants throughout the 37-day incubation period. So this is a table, similar table to the SV8 results, now showing the results with PEDV. And again, orange rectangles background indicates bioassay. We had a lot more negative samples here with PED. Obviously, it's a virus that is not as stable as Seneca virus is. One of the interesting things here is that if you look at soybean meal, most of our soybean meals products that were spiked with PED, they were detected on virus isolation, indicating that soybean meal is indeed one of those products that allows survivability of this virus a lot better than the other products. So similar data here on titration. So we went on and did the titrations on soybean meal. When we compare baseline titers on our positive untreated control feed, we obtained 3.4 logs of PED out of those samples. Then when we look at the results with the mitigants, we detected on the 3 mitigants that are highlighted here, number 2, 7, and 8, the titers that we obtained after the 37 days were between 1.5 and 2.3. Again, we saw some variability among some of these mitigants in terms of their effectiveness when they were added at the country of origin or here in US. And this is the data basically summarizing the 4 viruses that we did. So for PRRS and BHV1, one of the drawbacks of those two viruses is that we were not able to detect or quantify the virus that was left after the 37-day incubation period. They're not as stable as Seneca and PED, so we don't have a way of measuring how much virus we were able to detect that. What I want you to, when we look at this combined table with all the data, what it strikes out is basically those three mitigants that are highlighted here. If we look at number 2, number 5, and number 8, we'll see that those are the ones that we actually were able to recover the lower amount of virus with Seneca and PED, and number 2, and also with PRRS and BHV1, we didn't detect any virus on those samples after the swine bioassay. When we look at titer reductions, SVA with number 2, we got about 2.7 log reduction, 2.2 with mitigant number 5, and 2.8 with mitigant number 8. PEDV, number 2, we got mitigant number 2, we got about 1.9 log reduction, 1.7 log reductions with mitigant number 5, and 1.8 log reduction with mitigant number 8. So take-home message of this is that among the 10 mitigants that we screened on this study, there is a select group of mitigants that seems to reduce viral load in those ingredients that we tested. However, there's no product that will completely sterilize the feed. We still have viable virus at the end of the experiment. Some critique to this study and some of the weaknesses is that this is an in vitro study. We are doing laboratory scale experiments that we can actually manage. We tested near 1,500 samples on this experiment. So the volume of feed that was used is much smaller than what we'll see in the real world. We only used one contamination dose. We used 10 to the 5 to spike these feed ingredients, and we tested the mitigants against that viral load. And that's the reason for that is also the number of samples, the number of mitigants that we needed to use. And this dose was the same dose that we used in our survival study. So we decided to keep that, and maintain consistency with that study. It is difficult to assess efficacy of these products against viruses that don't really survive well, because we don't have an endpoint titer that we can compare at the end of the experiment, and those are the results with PRRS and BHV1. Another point here is that we don't know if the reduction in titers are sufficient to actually prevent infection or transmission. We observe this reduction in titers now. Is this enough to prevent a pig to getting infected from these viruses? So one study that is on the works now is the continuation of this, is where we're going to select a subset of these mitigants and contaminate feed with the same viruses, mitigate with the selected mitigants, and then instead of doing the in vitro work, cell culture-based work, we'll actually feed the animals and let them ingest that contaminated and mitigated feed to see if we can actually prevent that infection. We will also, part of the design of this experiment is actually using different challenge doses. So we'll do a titration-based experiment in which we'll at least test 3 different doses against those mitigants. And with that, I'm going to pass on to Scott now, and he will continue the discussion. Thank you.
I'm kind of hyper, so I'm going to use this one. And I'm hyper because I'm excited. And the last 2 or 3 weeks have been a whirlwind. I have been on the phone meeting with people, African swine fever, every minute of the day. It's been a challenging time, and people are nervous. But I'm enthused. I'm optimistic. And I'm optimistic because I want to shout out to the feed industry a great thank you for how things are being managed today versus the days of PED. There's such a difference in collaboration, sharing, attitude, science, quality control. I'm getting white papers from various manufacturers saying, how does this protocol look? Am I doing everything we can to reduce the risk of contamination should this virus come into the U.S.? And how do we prevent it from coming in from our manufacturing plants? That's really different than how it was a few years ago. I think it's great we've got some data now. We're ahead of the game. PED, we were so reactive. We were running all the time. We've actually got some information on African swine fever that is becoming even a larger data set. So we're ahead of the game. So I'm excited. And one of the things I'm most excited about, and I think it's helped the discussion, is this idea that I introduced yesterday at the ASAV session of responsible imports. This is an idea that our CEO, Luke Minion, came up with. And I think what Luke's vision has allowed us to do is to kind of take a deep breath and relax and talk about ways to potentially reduce the risk of African swine fever virus coming in through feed ingredients. And so Luke's challenge to me was, how are you going to do it? We have to bring in certain ingredients from high-risk situations, vitamins, for example, from China. And with the epidemic of ASFV happening, how are we going to do that? So I'm going to basically bare my soul here, and I'm going to show you one person's approach. And this is a microbiological approach. Not everyone may not agree with this approach. And I open it up for discussion and debate. And it's a very preliminary approach based on a very limited data set. Okay? But we're going to start the discussion. We're going to get better as we learn more over time. So bear with me on this, and I look for any and all critique as we try to collectively make this process better. So this is a science-based approach to introduce key ingredients from high-risk countries. And basically, it's got several components listed here in the equation on the bottom. We're going to look at level of contamination. We're going to look at transport time. We're going to look at mitigant effect on viral load, half-life of virus, and common sense. So I'm going to take you through the math, how this process kind of came to be, and I'm really looking forward to your input. So, as I mentioned, we have data. We have data on the survival of African swine fever virus as well as other viruses in feed ingredients. Some beautiful work here by Diego and his team, Megan Niederwerder and her team, and Jeff Zimmerman at Iowa State have really shown us in our model, when we start with 5 logs TCID50 in each of these ingredients, how much virus do we end up with at the end of either the 37-day trans-Pacific model, for Seneca in this case, our FMD surrogate, or African swine fever using the actual pathogen at Kansas State in the 30-day transatlantic model. So you see the titers. We start with 10 to the 5, and you can see the half-life estimates that Jeff helped calculate. So what you see is, some of these viruses are pretty similar as far as their stability in feed. They're both very, very stable. It varies a little bit by ingredient. You can see some of the bulk grains may be more favorable, i.e. soybean meal, and some of the fine ingredients such as amino acids and vitamins may be less favorable. But the viruses still can survive under these laboratory conditions in these ingredients. And we can start to look at estimated half-lives. And I say estimated because we're going to start with a very limited data set. That's acknowledgement limitation number 1. But again, we're going to start somewhere. And we're going to make some predictions on how long this half-life curve, or what it might look like, how long would this virus actually survive in feed. Estimated. It's basically a straight line right now. It might not be a straight line in real life. We're looking at further assessment of this line to see if it's more curvilinear. So bear with me on that. But let's look at that information, and can we use it to start the conversation? Now, Diego, I think, has done a wonderful job, and I know Megan's working on it too, on mitigation. This is an important part of the responsible import calculation. What mitigant effect could we plug into the equation? These are Diego's data. I've just kind of reworked it a little bit, and basically showing you the titer at the end of the 37-day journey for Seneca and for PED, similar to what he just showed you. And from this, we're going to select a mitigant. The flexibility of this model is you can put in whatever mitigant you want. But just for the sake of discussion, let's pick mitigant G. Now we see in mitigant G, it started with 5 logs of Seneca virus, took it down to 2.5 logs over that 37-day journey. And in case of PED, it dropped it from 5 logs to 1.5 logs. So it did a nice job. Nice job. You can see some of these mitigants did a really, really good job. That's exciting. Some of them didn't work so well, but that's okay. We wanted to kind of understand who are the players in the game. Who are the future studies or the future products that we should evaluate? Okay. Now let's look at the formula. Again, draft. You see draft, right? This is a starting point. This is a draft. This is one person's idea. But it's a good time to start to talk. So let's look at Seneca, PED, and African swine fever as 3 viruses. We're going to try to understand how to safely take them from 5 logs down to 0. This is protection of the border, not infectious dose. I want to get all the virus out. I don't want any of it coming in. So we're going to start with 5 logs. And you could say, well, that's kind of a swag. But that's how we started our discussions with our studies with a 5-log TCID50 inoculation. It was a start there. We don't know that yet. We don't really know what the level of contamination is, but for the sake of discussion, we're going to start with 5 logs. Box number 2 is mitigant and log reduction. So in the case of Seneca and PED, we have mitigant data. And in the case of mitigant G that we just selected, you can see its effect. It reduced viral load in each of those viruses, 2.5 logs and 3.5 logs. Okay? Now, ASFV, until Megan finishes her work, we won't really know what the effects of mitigation is on that virus. So right now, I have to say, not applicable. So, if we have that mitigant effect, and we start with 5 logs at the source, that means we end up with approximately 2.5 logs of virus on arrival, at the end of the 37-day journey, in the case of Seneca, and 1.5 logs in the case of PED. Now, we know from our work, the slide you just saw, that when we start with 5 logs TCID50 in the Kansas State model, we end up with 3 logs TCID50. We lost 2 logs of virus in that transatlantic model that Megan and her team carried out for us. So that's just the effect of time. Okay? So now we have an estimate on the amount of virus on arrival. Now, let's look at the half-life. Now, this is based primarily on soybean meal. There's just a single ingredient I'm looking at here. Worst case scenario. This could obviously change depending on the ingredient. That's the value of having some of these half-life data. So for Seneca, we know in soybean meal, it's roughly about a 10-day half-life, 9.7 to be exact. PED we've calculated at 3 days. And ASFV, basically the half-lives were very similar across most of the ingredients as you saw. So we're going to basically round it up to 2, just for easy math. So, based on half-life, titer effect, or mitigant effect on titer, the calculated necessary storage period that one could start to think about implementing with all its limitations would be 30 days for Seneca in this model, 10 days for PED, and 20 days for African swine fever. Now, how did we get there? Because this is kind of like the end of the journey. We have the mitigant plus a storage period to get to ground zero on viral load. How did we get to 20 days? Let's look. Let's do some real basic half-life calculations. And again, Jeff Zimmerman has been a great educator in many areas of science, but he really understands this half-life stuff. So I give Jeff a lot of credit. So let's just look at half-life calculation as a virologist would look at it in TCID50, or how maybe other people might like to look at it better as percent reduction. 2 different ways of looking at it. So on the far left-hand column, You see number of storage days. So every 2 days is a half-life. So we're going to look at the change in viral load over time as we add 2 days onto the storage period in sum. So we start with 10 to the 3. From the TCID50 perspective, the anti-log of 10 to the 3 is 1,000. You can see how we simply just do the division all the way down at 2-day increments. And we can get down after 20 half-lives down to basically 10 to the 0, which is an anti-log of 1. If you don't like to look at it that way, look at it as percent reduction or percent viral remaining virus. We start with 100%. You can see the effect on percent virus in the product over time. By the time we get down to 20 days, we're at 99.9% reduction in viral load. So it depends how you like to look at it. I like the TCID50 way. You might prefer the percentage. They're basically telling you the same thing. So that's how we came up with the proposal for a 20-day storage period based on the data we have today. All right. Now, the beauty of half-life, as Jeff will tell you, it's independent of dose. Half-life is going to be consistent, independent of dose. So that initial swag where we threw out 5 logs to start, you can use any number you want. And you can apply a half-life calculation to that amount. And you can see from his example here, you go through 13 to 17 half-lives, independent of what that number is, and you will have basically a very negligible amount of virus remaining on a percentage basis. So it's a pretty powerful tool that I think we can use as an industry to make our recommendations as scientifically as we can. So let's critique this. The advantage of half-life, it gives us some guidelines in regards to viral extinction without having to measure it. Just simple percentage reduction. It's very easy to understand. It doesn't depend on dose, and you can custom design your half-lives based on, say, bulk ingredients or fine ingredients. Is it soybean meal you're worried about, or is it vitamins and amino acids you're worried about? You calculate it differently, understanding those half-life. Now, limitations, it's a limited data set. It's a 2-point line. It may not be a true straight line slope. We are calculating more points within that line to see if it's more curvilinear. Clearly a limitation, I acknowledge. But we have to start somewhere. This is a pretty good starting point. Now, there's been a lot of discussion. Well, what if you warmed it up? What would that do? Great point. It might make the curve go a little steeper. So we need to understand the role of environmental variables. But on the other hand, what if there's blood in the mix for African swine fever, for all of its ability to survive in red cells? Could that extend survival? Feces, we don't know that yet. This is just straight virus in feed. So these are limitations we have to explore, and they're good studies that probably should be done. So I might ask Paul, if he's up for it, to come with me to the stage. One of the things I really have to thank Paul. He's been working with me on this almost on a daily basis. We've been discussing this back and forth almost every day, and we've tried to come up with a sum of different options that just to leave us with for discussion. So, Paul, I think you kind of led this initiative, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, the issue here is that through all of that experimentation, Scott and Diego showed that we have different values, different half-life for different products. And so the question becomes, and with all the discussions that I've had, telephone calls and emails with manufacturers as well, it's saying, but I know my manufacturing conditions are this way. And if I know they're this way, then why do I have to do something else? Because I can tell you, I can show you what it is, and I have confidence in the safety of this product. So it starts to put together a range of products and a range of options then. For example, under biosecure conditions, and if it's under biosecure conditions, whether it's in an FAD positive area, for an animal disease positive area or negative, and that may change. So independent of that, if it's under those biosecure conditions, then how are you going to handle a product like that? Well, you confirm the conditions by which it was manufactured, and that's through the manufacturer. Or the FDA has the Foreign Supplier Verification Program and maybe blockchain. We're looking at that with the University of Minnesota to give some guidance as to how those could be applied. But in that spot, you've got pretty good confidence that that product is safe to begin with. So the question is, do you really need a holding time for that? A second option, which we know we have, is that these materials might not be manufactured in a spot where you have a lot of confidence. In the manufacturing process, that could happen. And if that's the case, and you find that out, and you go through your supplier, and that's the case, then you can apply the holding time of the product at the milling facility, the appropriate holding time. You could require a mitigant to be added, which may decrease that holding time, or light bulb goes on, you source it from somewhere else if you can do that, in order to do that. So that adds another level of assurance to a product that you're not so confident in. And then you get to the bulk products that the data indicates may provide even more risk, provide a higher risk of maintaining the virus as an imported product. And those bulk products, for examples, soybean meal and DDGs, and you saw the data up there. For those, it's really about the same thing. For those, you apply the appropriate holding time, and you saw that for soybean meal with, I think it was SVA, was a 10-day half-life. So 13 times 10 days, 130 days at least for holding time. And then you consider, and a thing for discussion here, is that Scott and Jeff and Diego have calculated half-lives, but that's where we're at with what we know. When you talk about downtime for biosecurity or other methods, other things that you have to implement for biosecurity that's measurable, generally, as even ARS does with their recommendations from coming off of Plum Island. You take the half-life, you take what you think is right based on the science, and double it. And double it for that margin of safety. And so for bulk ingredients, the half-life, apply the holding time, require a mitigant, which may decrease the holding time, or don't source it from those countries that could be a risk. So that's a way to approach it, and that's part of the thing that I want to have a discussion about after we're done here.
So with that, we'll close this part of the lecture. And again, thanks to the feed industry, thanks to many of the companies who are coming forward and saying this is exactly what we need. We have to be responsible importers, and we're going to practice this approach. We're going to modify that to fit our scheme. But I think it's a concept that we can all stand on and communicate with a clear voice. And the common sense, I think, is kind of the part, don't source from high-risk ingredients from high-risk countries. That's the fifth and final part that Paul was referring to there. The data suggests there are certain things that we simply should not bring into the country from certain areas. Okay?
Okay. Help me to thank Scott, please.